Hello, today we're going to be talking about IBM MQ and how it's changed over the years. And to help me do that, I've got two veterans of the product with me. I've got Kim and Dave. Do you want to introduce yourselves? Kim, do you want to go first?
Sure, yeah. Kim Clark, I work in the Hersley Labs. I've been in the integration space for about 30 years now, and 20 of those in IBM, and just generally work with customers on integration modernization, focused on MQ at the moment.
So I'm David Ware. So I'm an IBM lifer, and I'm distinguished engineer, and I'm CTO for IBM MQ. So I have the joy of leading the engineering side for the product.
Cool. And I'm Aiden Gallagher. I'm a solution architect with Expert Labs. So on customer site, building and delivering the product on a day-to-day basis. So we're going to start off with how long have we been using the products and how has MQ evolved over that time? So what changes have you seen in the product since then? Again, I think we'll start with you, Kim.
Yeah, so I think my first time of touching MQ was back in the mid to late 90s. And back then, it was the only mechanism of getting some types of communication between certain operating systems and things like that. This is before ubiquitous IP, before HTTP, competing with Corba and DCOM and things like that at this point, but they were obviously synchronous based, And it was a very different world back then, but it was solving the problem, same problem it's solving now in many ways, of getting you between one platform and another, and doing that in a robust asynchronous way. So, yeah.
You said using MQ, so not sure about that. So if I plot... So I came into IBM in 95. I was a fresh-faced graduate at that point. Didn't know anything really about the real world of software or IT or anything like that. And my first job was into the MQ department, and I was building MQ at that point. So I was building MQ on weird operating systems I'd never heard of before, let alone seen. So I didn't really use MQ back then. I didn't even know what it was for. That was back in the mid-90s. So it wasn't really until probably, a few years after that where I sort of did a bit of that. I did a bit of testing. I did a bit of developing and engineering on MQ. And then even actually leaving MQ and moving outside of that was probably into the early 2000s was when I first really understood what MQ was. So I've been around MQ for I guess, the longest of the three of us, just about. Probably I'd just edge it on Kim, but actually understanding what the hell it does is probably I came to that later by being in the engineering team as opposed to being on the user's side. And as part of that, I think I really took a while to grasp the importance of MQ. I could tell it was really important. So I came in, like I said, 95. It had only been out in the market for a couple of years at that point, I think. But it felt like a really professional and big thing that I was coming into at that time. A lot of buzz around it, a lot of excitement. It definitely sort of felt like it was more established than I guess it probably, in hindsight, it really was at that point. But I still couldn't really understand why you'd want it. But like Kim said, I sort of learned that it was about connecting systems together. Particularly initially, I think that was probably the primary thing where it was very hard to connect them without something like MQ. And therefore, it was all about getting as many platforms as possible. So, like I said, I was in that team where they were bringing on new platforms and we had to have the infrastructure for it. So we were bringing things like, Windows NT and Solaris and platforms around about that time where sort of they were new into IBM and new into sort of having a unified solution across all of them. So that was probably the primary thing. You said, how has it changed? I guess that does continue, but I guess it's less important from a point of view of really trying, different systems are different systems now. There's multiple ways of getting between them. So I think it was more the asynchronous side of it has sort of come up through. It took me even longer to realize the need of that. But that asynchronous decoupling, we've got the coupling through the connectivity, but we've got the decoupling from being asynchronous. And that's the real thing. That's the real sort of ageless thing, I think, with messaging and therefore MQ that sort of continues to today. So less about obviously the platforms and all that sort of stuff. Form factors have continued to change and evolve, and maybe we'll get onto that, but that's sort of by the by. But the thing that stayed definitely the same is that asynchronous sort of decoupling and that ability to be able to, build scalable, resilient systems and sort of even out those differences in the end systems and how things interact.
I do remember a lot of sort of bridging technologies that we had to juggle with around that time before the MQ became so ubiquitously across platforms as it is today. And that was, I remember that was really hard. You'd think, oh, surely this is just connect one messaging system to another, but it really wasn't that easy. And then when MQ came through as saying, right, we're going to go out and tackle all these different platforms and be available on these platforms. It's like, oh, thank goodness. All I've got to do is write to that same interface, which became standardized interfaces over time. So, the early stages of change were all about that platform ubiquity, I think. And then later, I mean, it's really become that same story of decoupling between different types of platforms, but those platforms are even more spread out than they were before in a way. They're different cloud providers, or between on-premise and cloud and things like that. And it's still creating that capability, but it's even more of a broad network now than it was before, maybe.
So I joined IBM in 2015, and I used MQ from an App Connect perspective. I was doing testing in what was IBM Integration Bus release, and I was doing the MQ build there. So that was my sort of first introduction. But then I went out when I started doing more, going out into the field, which was about a year or so later. MQ is already very established. I think there's facts, something about a 90% utilization rate across the FTSE 100, something like that. And I was like, oh wow, this is big, and it is one of the biggest integration products we have, I believe. Was it instantly ingrained in like banks and across the industry, or was it a slow build up?
So maybe Kim, you've got more of a context about it. Like I said, I was on the inside and I was looking out, and I was surrounded by, and I remember very sort of senior people telling us how successful it was and all those sorts of things. So I think it really did explode right from the start. So even back then, but then again, it is, I guess it probably went on its own hype cycle of everybody was talking about it and everybody was finding reasons to use it. But then it probably went through that cycle, and then it really has sort of become ingrained, like you say, into just about every system.
Yeah, I think what and this is a sort of a personal perception, that I saw it become essential to highly transactional engines initially. So it was within application messaging, but it was all about the data integrity and the transactionality and two-phase commits and things like that. That was its launch pad of really sort of going into the big organizations. But then, because it was already there, it suddenly became this more distributed connectivity between applications, and then it sort of had a second wind from that. But I think it all depends on what projects you saw as you came through that history, really.
And I suppose when I joined, everything was already established. The big areas that were the things that were big when I joined IBM. One was blockchain, which has become big in a different way. Other ones has obviously been cloud deployments, which obviously MQ is on cloud and does that well. But also containerization. I suppose my question is, what have been the biggest? Because the containerization story was very big. It took a lot of SMEs, and still is very hard for a lot of traditional MQ SMEs to be like, why are we doing this? What is a container platform? It was a big jump. What were the big jumps in the technology, and what's MQ had to sort of evolve to work with over time?
So first, I would touch on containers. You singled out containers. It's interesting. So around about the time, I guess, you were coming in, Aiden, that was the time when I took on, or started to take on, this sort of role. And containers were coming along, like you said. So 2015 was the first point where MQ supported containers. And it was almost like an academic exercise as to whether it could. And we sort of realized quite early on that it wasn't a major change to MQ to fit into here. It wasn't even a major conceptual change. And that sort of stemmed from whether it was fantastic planning or foresight or just luck. But MQ was well positioned to slot into, a very sort of small, componentized, distributed style of solution, because it wasn't a big centralized thing that just had to run in the middle. But people have put it into the middle in some situations, but that's not how it was designed. It was designed always to be distributed. It was always to be lots of things plugged together, loosely coupled in itself. So it was actually, the bigger thing with containers was less around maybe the technology, although like you said, that is a big thing. We have to make it, more and more sort of seamless in how you operate it and manage it there. But sort of it was more about trying to break people away from those preconceptions or how they've used it in the past, because the systems they were running it on sort of forced them down that route. So that was quite an interesting one, I think, in that it was sort of more it was a mindset thing rather than a technology thing, in my view, for that one. Technology things, I think. So my first engineering gig, like I said, how I came into MQ, the first project I was on was doing the first topic-based publish subscribe solution in MQ, and we're talking like late 90s. So even those sorts of things, it broke out from being a queue focused thing, although queue is obviously fundamental to it, but it broke out into a different delivery style, a different distribution style. Similar around at that time, things like MQ clustering came in, which really was before its time almost. Very sort of visionary in what you could do, a dynamically distributed solution which can do horizontal scaling, it can do discovery, it can do bring in and scale to thousands of independent nodes, the sort of thing that you would want to put on the whiteboard if you were designing something from scratch today. So all of those things, they've been around in MQ for a long time, and it's almost like the industry has been catching up to them, to sort of the way that you operate and deploy them now makes those things more achievable with less effort through the operational model, and therefore they really are starting to see their time. So I would sort of pull those ones out, I guess.
I guess that's what stemmed the people process agile integration, Kim, which MQ's in. So.
Yeah. So in fact, I was even going further than that, to broader than that, if you like, to what really happened when containers came onto the scene and microservices came onto the scene. It was the first time that we had a sort of a more universal opinion of what it means to write a good component for agnostic infrastructure, if you like. VMs and things like that have been around for some time, but we now had a sort of ubiquitous reference image for how to do it with Kubernetes and containers and things like that. So, and I, around that sort of time, I started capturing that and trying to apply it to the integration space, as you say, with agile integration. But I think the fact that was actually the tail end of quite a long history of cloud engineering. And MQ, as a really well-written product, had been taking those lessons on board all the way along. So that's why it wasn't such a surprise, because it had always been written in the right way for that sort of thing. And I think the side that Dave didn't mention, I think, is that it's way harder to apply those kind of agnostic features to cloud infrastructure when you deal with persistence. And that is a much harder thing to do. It's all very well to talk about, scaling stateless logic all over the place. Anybody can do that, right? Well, it's not quite that easy, but that's the easy problem. But the persistent problem is the hard one. And we've been really lucky with some of the things that we've been able to leverage from the base of MQ right from the early days, in the way that we've been able to apply those things to cloud native, and they've just fitted really well.
Yeah,
I still hear the perception on the container side that from 12 factor apps that all containers should be stateless, for example, which I know has been a bit of a learn. It's something we've had to go and talk to customers about, isn't it? Sorry, Dave, I interrupted you.
No, and it is related to that and what Kim was saying. There is that side of it. There was definitely, around about that time, I guess, about a decade ago, we were talking like it was a sort of an idealistic view, I guess. It's like, and I remember even having that conversation, I think, with you, Kim, around that time. That sort of, okay, yes, you can be stateless, you can get state out of certain layers, but you're going to end up with state somewhere. And then, like you say, then it just makes it harder for the layer that has to handle the state, and that in our situation is where MQ steps in, and it does it very well. And I think the thing, if we look at sort of nearer times and sort of revolutions or evolutions there, I think that whole resiliency model, again, it's sort of MQ based on its original concepts and even implementation in some situations is very well grounded in resiliency and recovery and state. The thing that we had to sort of marry up to that in more recent times is around the availability and the expectation around that, and being able to take systems offline, being able to, there used to be a pride in how long you could keep a queue manager up and running for. The more months you could account to that, the better it was. These things, or years even, these things are just crazy when you think back as to that was the sign of success. Whereas the sign of success now is I can do whatever I want to it, and I just externally don't see an impact to the availability, which is what messaging is typically all about. And that's where we've really put the effort in recently.
And was it more the container side of things, or was it more cloud availability or was it the state that led to like application level replication with RDQM and then later native HA? What led to that?
You've got an element of chicken and egg there, but I think it's not. I don't think it's about containers. I think it's about, as I say, writing things for a cloud agnostic infrastructure and doing that in the right way. And containers just happens to be an example of that. And I think that's the thing we're targeting, is how do we do it? And recent examples of this are where we brought things that we've achieved in containers like native HA and said, well, look, this works on VMs as well. It's just the best way to do it. It's a good algorithm for how to do it.
I think it is just trickle down technology, and it's sort of, the container side, containers came from being able to manage things in a way that gives me the scale and availability and the dynamic, utilization, which happened to align to cloud, which happened to align to how people wanted to pay for things and how people wanted to run things and own them or not own them. So it's all sort of wrapped up in that. And then occasionally you get something like containers that comes through and like sort of that's an embodiment of it. But like Kim said, it's more about, it was just an evolution. And what we picked up on was definitely that evolution and that moving away from, complexity of sort of physical infrastructure to sit your solutions on top of. And MQ needed to sit on top of them. And therefore, the more dependency we had on the storage doing certain things for us, the machines and, the virtualization doing certain things for us, that meant that it was just more complicated and more costly in some situations for people to adopt and use MQ or evolve MQ into new uses and new platforms. And that's where we've sort of moved more and more towards a self-sufficient way of doing MQ resiliency, and sort of lowered the bar on those external dependencies. And I think that's just a general, and we did that partly because that was a general thing. That's where software, and that's how solutions have gone.
I wanted to also pull back. So earlier you mentioned PubSub and how that was one of the first things you worked on. It's made me think about PubSub. It's not the same, but it's made me think about streaming as well. Don't shoot me. But I wondered how the perception of messaging has changed over time as well. So even in my 10 years of using MQ, the perception has been more that, okay, things might be on event streams and more callable in that way. And we're having to have sort of conversations with customers about, okay, well, they're two separate use cases, and messaging is still a core asynchronous theme. What do you think the perception of MQ has been since the 90s through to now? How has it changed, and where might it be going?
So something's obviously happened since around 2011 with the introduction of Kafka into the landscape. And so, messaging is not the only pub-sub asynchronous mechanism in town. And there are, this is something we could talk for a lot longer than we will have time for on this podcast, but there are interesting, fascinating differences between what messaging does and what Kafka does. I think one way I like to look at that, and I'm deliberately not using the phrase streaming because I think that is a bit broader than just this, but specifically Kafka. I think comparing messaging and Kafka, I've tried using analogies, and I've always ended up needing to use several, and I think that's quite telling, because it means there are multiple different dimensions in which these things are different. And if you constrain a conversation to, just how it does publish subscribe, or just how it scales, or just how it does this, or just how it does analytics, or just how it does transactions, then you never see the whole picture of how these two things are different. But they are different with very different sweet spots. And any complex integration pattern, you usually find the need for both of those. And one of the analogies I often use is the idea of in the human body, you have the circulatory system and the nervous system. And I won't go into how I sort of compare those to the two technologies, but the important thing is that those two systems evolved alongside each other to suit different needs. And you find that with most of the analogies, you'll find that both of them are needed in the end.
So first off, I mean, we bring in streaming and streaming Kafka, wherever we want to place it. First off, I think, you talked about perception. I think it was sort of, it's been a positive thing in many ways. So if we think back a little bit before that period, we were getting into the API period, where effectively we'd sort of moved from that, like we said right at the start. What was MQ trying to solve? It was trying to solve different systems being able to communicate between them. REST APIs, HTTP came along, basically blew that away, and now it was nice and simple and ubiquitous. At which point we were into a sort of an era of, it's like, well, why do we really want messaging? That seems complicated. That's operationally complex. From an application point of view, it's more nuanced than what I get with a synchronous API. So we were going through that period where APIs were basically coming along and people were going, well, APIs can do absolutely everything. And therefore, it's always the thing. If you're the incumbent, if you're the guys who are already there, you're sort of going, yeah, but don't forget about these things. There's a reason why you need to do this and the benefits from it. And then streaming comes along, Kafka comes along, and basically sort of opens up that whole debate again, which was really good because it opened up the debate to go, okay, look, there's another reason why you can't just do synchronous APIs all the time. There's another reason why you need to have something in the middle. You need to be able to collect data and you need to be able to sort of process data. We can debate whether it can do all the things that messaging can do or not. And, Kim's analogy is a good analogy. I'm very much a supporter of different tools for different jobs, and there's a reason why these tools have become really, really good at what they do. It's a really complicated world that we live in, and therefore you need to have the differences where necessary. But it has sort of given us the opportunity to go, there isn't just one size fits all. And we have to remember every time that we have a new thing that comes in, the reason it came in is because the previous thing was not one size fits all. So it's unlikely that this thing is the one size that fits all. And therefore, you tend to sort of just add these things to it. And there's definitely situations where I would say I've seen MQ used in the past, or tried to use in ways where you think it was okay at the time because it was the only technology that really you could put into that space. But now you've got more choice. And maybe you would design something in a different way. I totally agree with what Kim was saying. I think we do need to remember that something like a message queuing solution is trying to solve a different thing to what a streaming solution was, just because it happens to have, messages in, or blobs of data, or the asynchronous word, or topics, or queues, or whatever you put in it. Just because it has some of the same vocabulary doesn't mean that it's trying to do the same thing or can solve things in the right way. So very much a sort of a supporter of multiple different approaches depending on what you're trying to achieve.
I think I've seen the conversation more with greater sort of federation of services. So the teams that are actually building integrations in some scenarios are also the teams that are building the applications. So maybe don't have the nuanced view of the different technologies that could be used and when they're best suited. So if I don't know, if you're relatively unread on integration, you might say, okay, well, I'll use an event stream then because that's what's pervasive in sort of the literature. You might talk about REST APIs, GraphQL. You might be tempted towards more the most recent thing that's been output. Yeah. But MQ has its place, and
just queues in general have their place. Everything is built on queues. There are queues at every single level of technology and real life. It's not like we've wiped them out and replaced them with something else. They still importantly exist. I mean, the interesting thing is as something like Kafka has evolved, it's started to sort of, maybe play down the sort of, this is the one approach. You do event sourcing for absolutely everything, and it tends to sort of be a little bit more softened and then brings in other concepts and other opportunities. So I think that's the key thing, really. I think what we do have to do is we have to do a better job of explaining why and the virtue of these different technologies, because like you say, it's very easy just to pick up the last thing you heard about or someone told you about, and therefore adopt it, and learn the hard way of where it does and doesn't necessarily suit your needs. So we have to do as good a job as possible of trying to help there, and folks like Kim, myself, and yourself, Aiden, that's what we do, isn't it? That's what we try and explain to people. We just hope that people are listening.
So on that theme, I don't mind who answers it. What is the best real world example of MQ today? Maybe not only MQ, but that MQ does best. If you had to pick one.
So, I mean, Kim's already touched on it, where MQ found its foothold, which is basically in that incredibly resilient, sort of very precise way. The way I tend to describe it is, synchronous communication is the simplest way of talking between things, because it's like we're talking now. You can ask a question, you get an answer back, when you've got the answer, what the answer was, you can go about your business. Nice and simple, there's no ambiguity there. As soon as you go asynchronous in any form, you've got a level of ambiguity. You're pushing something out into the ether. You're just sort of trusting that something is going to happen with it, and therefore, if you've got a high expectation or a high requirement on that thing happening, you want to pick a technology which reduces the ambiguity as much as it can, which basically means upping the assurances of something happening. Partly that's through syntax, and partly it's through sort of technical features, but it's also through about proven experience and trust. And I think there's that as well within a technology like MQ. People really do trust it for that delivery. So from that point of view, that can be because it's a few very, very valuable messages going through the system, or it might be because it's millions or billions of lower value messages going through it, but you need that system to be available. So there's different dimensions, but ultimately it comes down to that trust and expectation, and the fact that it's a proven thing rather than a sort of academic sort of declaration of trust.
Yeah.
And I think I'd probably extend that. So there's that being able to talk to it in a trusted way, but also being able to stretch that communication across a broad landscape and have it still be completely trusted. So it's one thing to be able to do that, between two components in an application or two applications sitting next to each other on the same system, but to then be able to say, it doesn't actually matter if it's on the other side of the world in a different data center on a different cloud provider. I'm not going to worry about that as an application owner. That same level of integrity is also going to happen at the communication level underneath.
That is a really important one, is that separation between how the application interacts with MQ versus what's happening under the covers. And it's a very simple sort of rule. Once as an application I've got the message into the system, it will get to its destination. And it doesn't matter where or what's thrown in its way in that path, it will get through. And therefore that making life as simple as possible for the application, because the application hasn't got to worry about all the what ifs along that path. That's for MQ to worry about.
So the good example would be on my banking app, I make a payment, and then in the pending payments, it shows that the payment is being made, and I can see my current balance, which minuses that transaction. So from the app's perspective, the payment's gone. I haven't got that money anymore. That money is actually somewhere else. How that happens under the covers, MQ makes sure that actually does happen. We've said it's happened. Let's make sure it actually does happen.
Yeah, and everything will be settled. And yes, there is, and then you can make counter arguments, which is okay. Well, we will keep records and we can repair things, and if the inevitable, the worst happens, then we can recover from it. And yes, you can when you're using different technologies. It comes then down to operationally, how often do you want to be doing that, and what's the impact of doing that? I mean, I literally a couple of days ago, I happened to be looking. I think it was either my bank account or my credit card or something like that. I happened to be looking to see if something had come out, and I saw 4 or 5 things that they had 2 entries. Each of them had 2 entries in on my credit card, and it was like, I've sort of got faith that is all going to get ruled out, and that's all going to get balanced out. And a couple of days later, it did, so that was all good. But just in that moment, it was a bit like, okay, what's going on here? So it's about that sort of, it's a very hard thing to put a value on that dependability.
Feeling of security as the user. Yeah, sorry.
I think I'd probably say you could try to wrap this one up in look at any business in any industry. Look at the most critical transactions that you do in that business. Especially look at the ones that involve multiple systems. There will be MQ underneath it. There'll be messaging underneath it. You can't do it any other way than create that kind of reliability. Okay,
so I think we've just announced version 10. You guys have just announced version 10. And included in there, I'm going to have to use the buzzword. We're in June 26, so I'm going to have to use the buzzword. I'm going to have to talk about AI. So I'll ask a couple of questions and then I'll let you decide which ones you want to answer. So one is, what features could MQ, or what is it including, and how does the AI enhance the usage of MQ? And then I think more broadly, how may AI impact messaging as a whole, as a concept? Does it make it easier? Does it make it obsolete? I'm throwing random thoughts out. So go on, I'll let you.
Do you want to run with the first one, Dave, and I'll have a crack at the second, and we can swap back and forth?
We can do that. I think there's probably a third one in there as well somewhere. But what was the first one? First one was how is MQ
in product MQ? Really? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So you're right. So like any other product, we have AI capabilities. We have agentic capabilities built into version 10. What we did, we looked at that around about like we've obviously kept an eye on AI and its different forms over years, like the industry, but we've had a certain amount of sort of almost pushback from our users. It's a bit like sort of, I'm not sure that fits in this, in this really critical part of our infrastructure. And then about a year ago, that sort of really changed in the conversation, which was where people were starting to actually, no, we were all starting to see some value from it. We were starting to be sort of impressed by what we were seeing out of AI systems and agentic systems, and therefore that was sort of about the moment where it sort of changed, and we thought, okay, then how can we take advantage of it, or how can we give advantages to our users? And the thing there, we didn't go right, okay, then we'll stick AI into the mainline path of everything that's flowing through, your systems. That seemed like a bit of a brave leap at that point. And it says, well, okay, then if LLMs and agents are bringing sort of a non-human sort of SME into, capability in, which in many situations they are, then can we take advantage of that? So what we did, we looked at some of the sort of the problems where they're solvable with MQ, but you need a bit of experience, you need a bit of history under your belt to do that, and therefore that sort of narrows who can help here. And we looked at sort of operational. So it's like some of those tasks that come up, which are a little bit fuzzy, but they do come up, like, why are these messages building up? Why are the messages not getting through to the system? What's wrong with this particular route? Those sorts of things, that's where we thought we could put some real sort of effort in and get benefit from agents and LLMs who can start to reason which is what we all do when we're trying to diagnose problems. And that's really where we put the focus in today for AI, which is round about the operational side of MQ and trying to sort of help you there to lower that bar of understanding so that ultimately that improves, I would say, availability when you think about it. Because every time there's a blockage, every time there's a slowdown due to an application doing something or a network problem or whatever, it basically is impacting your availability. And therefore, if we can help from a skills point of view and get those back on quicker, then that improves your availability.
I think that resonates well at the moment because MQ has always been the first to blame in an issue. And I think if there's any MQ people listening, they'll know this, that you have to prove that MQ is innocent before anyone will even look at anything else. And that's despite MQ being resilient historically. And it's just because it's the middle object. So I think that's why that's resonated really well. And that being one of the first things that came out has meant people are more likely to adopt AI in the MQ space. So very, very good.
I think it's just to wrap that one up before we move on to the next one, that there's every reason why you could almost say MQ is a great place to triage the broader landscape problem. So rather than thinking first, MQ is the problem. No, MQ is probably not the problem, but MQ probably does know where the problem is. And where that queue build-up happens and which application is not feeding it, that's probably where the problem is. So have MQ almost as the triage place, and this I think is helping contribute to switching that opinion. So the secondary question, if I sort of got it right, was sort of turning it around the other way and saying, what place does messaging have as AI solutions start to take shape? Where we're likely to see messaging within that, and I think that one's. There's certain answers which are pretty clear, I think, is as you move from sort of the simple chatbot kind of communication with Gen AI and moved into sort of, MCP servers, but then agents that are more sort of longer span queries. And certainly as those become sort of system running in their own space rather than a user waiting for an answer, you inevitably end up in the asynchronous domain. Why would an agent want to talk synchronously to another agent? That's not we know that's not scalable, right? So that we will, just as we did with business process management and things, you'll move into the asynchronous domain for certain types of things. So I expect to see things like messaging embedded in whatever the protocol ends up being. It might A2A is a popular one at the moment, but whatever the protocols end up being between agents or whatever they are in the future as being, at least in some circumstances, messaging.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's the way to think about it. I mean, Aiden, you said, does AI make messaging obsolete? I think it's the reverse. I mean, it is, AI, it's just applications that need to talk to each other, and the smarter they get, they need to talk more. They're not the fastest things today, and that's also a thing where you don't want to be doing it like you don't want to be sat around waiting for these things. So exactly like Kim says, I think we're going to see more and more asynchronous decoupling of AI, and to do that, really, I think there's sort of two forms. There's the data side, which is agents and AI are going to need more real-time data, as in visibility of what's going on, to be able to give their insights and their reasoning. So that's where something like streaming comes along. That's something like Kafka comes along and helps in that. That gets the data, in a way that's accessible more and more to LLMs. But then there's the communication side, which is actually, well, how do I sort of request things or retrieve things? How do I go and kick off the next thing along that chain? Exactly like Kim was saying. So then that's a messaging side, and that's back to what we were talking about earlier. It's a bit like using the right tool for the job, and therefore even within that domain, you're going to see multiple sort of scenarios and multiple use cases.
Okay, so my personal view is that I mentioned blockchain earlier when I first joined IBM, and there's obviously things that appear to be, I don't know, a bit ubiquitous, that could work everywhere. I think at the moment I'm happy to try using AI for anything messaging related, and then see how useful they are in practice. I think that's really the only way we're gonna find out.
Yeah, I think there's things like another one, and we're having conversations, even last week, about discovery. using it to understand, some messaging systems, particularly MQ ones that have been around for a long time, can be really complicated, and they've lost in the mists of time as to what's in there and how do I get most value out of it and how do I change it, and therefore bringing something in that may be able to bring in that expertise to be able to understand these things. That's a potential great value.
Even little things like I playing about with Bob when it first came out, and I was looking at how long until, so the important, like from an operations perspective, how long until my queue is going to be full, so I know when I have to make a decision, like things like that, which are useful. I did think afterwards that maybe it didn't need AI. I could have just done
yeah, you're probably right, but it's interesting, isn't it, that we've had. This is sort of happening also around about the same time that, say, OpenTelemetry has come along, and therefore that's accelerated this sort of a conversation about getting access to the data, observability. And I think it's really back to, if AI is the SME who's got the view and has got access to all this information, then it can start to give you more of an opinion and less of just giving you the data. And therefore, if you get the data, you've got to work it out yourself.
I think AI is enabling us to, as it goes along with what you were saying, Aiden, enabling us to try more things than we've ever been able to try before. We may well do them for the first time using AI because we can knock it together so fast. But then a selection of those, and probably quite a lot of those, will gradually drop down the stack. In the same way that, solutions today, you start off writing them in high-level coding languages, and then they might need to be more optimized, and you draw them lower down. We'll see that happen, and they may drop out of AI once they become stabilized and we know exactly what the idea is. But the fun ground, if you like, is playing with AI to try those new ideas out.
Okay, right. Any I don't know, this generally broad, but a short answer would be good. Any general observations of MQ and messaging over your careers that you've got a chance, like a couple of sentences to summarize?
My one sentence for describing MQ is that it is the simplest way to decouple applications. And note that I didn't say the simplest way to connect them. I said the simplest way to decouple them. And so it pushes the complexity down into that layer. Yeah.
Dave?
I think I'd see that one and then add to that, yet frequently misunderstood. It's that the complexity that people think they see around it is more an indication of how it's been used or a lack of understanding as opposed to what's possible. So I think it's simple in concept, but quite often people are coupling or seeing it from the viewpoint of, well, I've been presented with this system and it's got years and years of evolution and change, and that causes complexity, which isn't technically an MQ problem. That's just a longevity problem.
And I think mine would be, you actually said it earlier, Dave, when I was thinking about my answer to this question, because I pre-prepared it, was that messaging itself hasn't really changed. What's actually happened is we've just had to add things to allow it to interact in other ways, like cloud containers, stream queues, for example. We've just had to enable MQ to interact with new things that are coming out. Cool. And my final question is, if you had to pick one MQ feature that was your favorite, what would it be out of all the releases?
Oh my goodness. I'm still thinking, Dave. Where's your head at?
It changes every time. I've been asked that before, and it's changed every time.
Okay, I think I've got an answer. So I'm going to go now. Sorry if I've stolen yours, Dave, but I'm going to go with clustering.
Damn it, you have.
Because the more I look into it, the more brilliant it is. I mean, the more things that we've put into that are just so clever. And as I came back into the MQ space in recent years and had chats with the engineers, Dave included, and I just sort of like, yeah, I knew clustering was good. I didn't know it did that. It just going. So apologies if I just stole the one you were going to say.
Yeah. as a broad thing, and a thing that has got so much potential. And when you see it used well, it's fantastic. We just take it for granted because it's been around for so long. But it is cutting edge in that respect.
And mine's going to be MQ Console because I don't have to set up RFH utils anymore.
Cool. Yep.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for listening. Thank you, Dave and Kim, for joining me. And I hope you've learned a little about messaging and what it's been and what it will be. So thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks, Aiden. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.